Now, another aspect of this is the whole financing of this. And the question comes up, how does this get financed and what are the implications for all of us that are ratepayers? And so our next speaker is Cameron Weist, who's a bond counsel, attorney, and generally been involved in many nonprofit financing situations. So he's going to give an overview for us. Cameron?
The difference between private finance and public finance, of course, is the obvious one. It hinges on a public agency's participation in the process. Ultimately, the goal is to finance a project, and if it's going to be a public participation and you're also going to achieve a tax-exempt rate, it has to also be a public project. Even though it's going to serve private individuals, you have to have both elements to have a tax-exempt rate, and therefore, under federal and state tax law, you would have a bond at the end of this that would be purchased by investors in the general marketplace through Merrill Lynch, Smith Barney, you name it. You can go to your local Charles Schwab and buy a $5,000 increment of a public bond. In this case, it would be Pacific Grove or whatever JPA ends up happening as a result of this process, but ultimately that would become the issuer. And the issue would become certificated or bonded, and therefore you could, as an individual, you could go purchase a $5,000 bond, in which if you total all the $5,000 bonds that are purchased, you would have the $150 million or whatever it's going to be to finance the project. So the difference between a private project and a public project, besides the public participation, because you've probably heard of, there's these new PP3, public-private partnerships and so forth. And really, the distinction there is that if you have a private participation that gets tantamount to a level of becoming a private issue, and there's profits being taken by a private company, the issue cannot be tax exempt, and therefore your interest rate suffers as a result of that. And I say suffer, but ultimately sometimes that's what has to happen, and certainly in Cal-Am's case, that is their situation. They're a private company, they take profits, and therefore they cannot issue under typical bond covenants and bond laws. There are some exceptions that are that happen very infrequently, and I'm sure Cal-Am cannot take advantage of them. And so therefore their issues are privately placed and privately funded, and therefore it's a private rate and a taxable rate. A difference, just as a rule of thumb, between a taxable rate and a tax-exempt rate. The tax-exempt on the same playing field, the same level credit criteria, everything else being given the same, is about 30 to 40% advantage to the full public tax-exempt process. So right off the bat, you can see there is and ultimately I heard some of the early speakers speak about, water and privatization and public and, those terms. Well, I can tell you in my practice, that's all I do, is I represent public entities, governments in public finance projects. And as part of the process, I feel it's the most transparent and the most fundamental to our nation, because it's only in that venue that you're going to get full transparency. There's no other venue that's going to achieve that. And so ultimately, when you're looking at all the federal and state laws of a public project, there's so many guidelines that determine exactly how everyone has to function, their roles. The roles I'm going to speak a little bit about in a minute with a public finance project. They're very traditional. All the consultants are very professional. They have a high ethical, moral training and background. And therefore, we're for the most part, at least in the bond counsel, the attorneys in the industry are unregulated to a large degree, because over time there just historically has not been defaults in the muni bond market. There have been a few, but so far, thank goodness, public agencies adhere to the Brown Act and all the different rules and regulations that allow the process to be an open process, and therefore there's questions and answers, checks and balances throughout the process. So aside from just the interest rate savings of a public process, you're going to also, as the public, you're going to be able to look at every single aspect of a public finance project. And ultimately, everybody's interest is the same. We all want to make sure that the cost is the absolute lowest cost possible. That's also one of the fundamental cornerstones of public finance. As I said, the roles that we're going to talk about in a minute, everybody's interest is to help the government, the governmental agency, lower its borrowing costs to the greatest degree possible, make sure that the engineering reports, make sure that the feasibility reports, all the other third-party consulting reports are at such a standard that ultimately when the investors look at the project, they're going to have the best and most complete set of circumstance possible from a credit perspective, so that they're going to be enticed to sharpen the pencil and ultimately get the interest rate to the absolute best optimal interest rate given that particular day that the bonds would be marketed, and that particular financing package given the credit profile of all these third-party reports, the government's credit rating, in this case Pacific Grove, as well as how many rate users do we have, what's the diversity, the number of users, what is the amount per user, because in public finance you also cannot overtax the property, because then you're negatively affecting the ultimate purpose of what we're trying to get to, which is the lowest rate. So everything is done to make sure that it helps the taxpayer, because that ultimately helps diversify the issue. It helps make sure that they can make their payments and that there's ample coverage on these securities so that they get out at the best rates possible. So I know I used that term, I threw that term out there quite a bit, but that is the truth. And I want to go into bond basics a little bit. Public finance, again, is one that when we're talking about a wastewater, a gas, an electrical, anything that has an enterprise that's different from the general fund of a municipality, it is governed under a different set of laws, which is called the Enterprise Fund Doctrine laws, and also Proposition 218, which is now part of the Constitution. I don't want to get into too much technical detail here, but I do want you to know that, again, those laws are in place to protect the ratepayer. They're there to make sure that an engineer has studied the project and that there's not $1 that goes to a designation that is outside of the fundamental use of the project. There has to be a nexus drawn between every dollar that's taxed and raised to every dollar that's spent, and it has to have a direct correlation, a direct nexus. So third-party reports are necessary under Prop 218. The same thing with the wastewater system. I believe that Pacific Grove has for its constituents. It has, when it wants to raise rates, it has to go through a protest hearing, and it has to put forward notices to everybody, telling them why the rates are being raised, what is the purpose, what is the amount, and the amount cannot be, as I said, $1 more than what is absolutely necessary to enhance that wastewater system, so that dollar for dollar, the ratepayers know exactly what they're being taxed for. So that's called a Prop 218, for lack of a better term, process. And that would also be true in this case. Just because it has a fancy name of a desal facility, in reality, it's just like any other enterprise fund. It's just like your water, wastewater. If you had like I said, an electrical or a natural gas facility or anything else that is municipally a typical enterprise situation, and you're spending public money on a public project, and ultimately you have to repay that somehow. In most water, wastewater, enterprise type things, it's always with the ratepayers. And again, the ratepayers get billed monthly or semi-month or bi-monthly. It just, there's different ways to do it. Sometimes through the county tax bill, sometimes just billed to you directly. But ultimately, it's all the same in public finance. And it all comes down to what we're used to doing on a daily basis, whether it's a $2 million project, whether it's $1 billion, it does not matter. It's just zeros for us in the industry. But what does matter is the due diligence, the level of professionalism that's involved with the city staff. And I like to use the analogy of a professional football team, because you have the general manager that kind of runs the team. That's the city council. You have your city staff, your city manager, your finance people. Those are the coaches. And you have your team. You have your consultants that have to come in. So I want to talk about the team a little bit. The team in this case is typically has to be a bond counsel, which is what I do. It's a law firm that specializes, I have over 20 years experience of giving public finance tax opinions that are accepted throughout the marketplace. So every single investor, when they invest in these bonds, they're getting a tax opinion that says that they're tax exempt. And that's what I do, that's what my office does. I've been doing it for a long time. That's the bond counsel. We are kind of the quarterback of the team, if you will, because we have to be responsible to the city council through staff to make sure that we're apprising, giving staff reports, apprising of the process. We set up the JPAs if necessary. We go through all the documentation. We review documentation with council in finance committee meetings. We make sure that all the due diligence is set before staff so they know exactly what we know and we know what they know so that we can get it to the investors and be in compliance with SEC rules and regulations, which is what governs these, as well as IRS regulations, so that you have a tax opinion that the investor can rely on at the end of the day. So with the bond counsel comes the responsibilities for the financing. Ultimately, you're going to want a financial advisor in. The financial advisor is the person that helps. The bond counsel compiles the information, puts it into a prospectus so the investors know exactly what the investment is. Desal, how many ratepayers, how many miles of pipelines, what does the project look like, what's it, you know, where are the dollars coming from, where are the dollars going. And we put that into a booklet. It's about usually a 100-page booklet along with the city's financing statements. That goes to the investors. And that's the financial advisor's job now to go out and solicit an underwriter to get the absolute best bids on the project. Those bids come in at the end of the day. You want to be in the A category. AA is preferable with a project like this. There's no natural triples anymore. AAAs, a lot of the bond insurers are defunct. There's only one, and they're not even a AAA. So if the city can get this into a AA category, it's doing very well for the ratepayer base. It's just, and those rates presently for a 20-year financing are less than, right around 3%, 3.1, 3.2%. What bond counsel also does with city staff is looks for SRF money, state revolving fund money. We're also looking to USDA. My office was retained by USDA 6 months ago to give public financing seminars to bolster their area specialist. I have a very good, our office has a good relationship, as do some other bond counsel firms. But ultimately, you want to get as much public money, grant money, and low interest rate money infused into this process so that you're going to lower your borrowing cost even more. And that's a very important component to this deal because we want to make sure that we have the absolute rock bottom rates because that's going to affect the bottom line for everyone. So those are the predominant players on the team. Again, it's a very tried and true process. I have a lot of other things I'd like to share with you, but I know we're somewhat at a time limitation this evening, so I think I'll just go ahead and turn the microphone over and leave it for questions at the end here.